delighted to have all you with us again today. I know many of you are working on unpausing your clinical trials and thinking about decentralized trials. So today we have the father of decentralized trials, Craig Lipset, with us. In 2011, he and his colleagues at Pfizer conducted the first entirely remote clinical trial. They even called it remote. It had no in-person visits at all. The trial involved online recruitment and screening, mailed study drug to a person's home, had laboratory testing in the community, and most importantly, had bladder e-diaries, which Craig will tell us in detail about. In 2011, his study was not perfect and it had difficulties recruiting, and we'll talk about that, but it's paved the way for the future of decentralized trials. Now, after a 12-year career at Pfizer, he serves on the advisory board of Humanity.co, is a venture partner at Boston Millennia Partners, and is the founder of Clinical Innovation Partners. Today, the visionary Craig Lipset joins us on Chet Talks. Welcome, Craig.
Ray, it is a pleasure to be with you. It's always a pleasure to be with you. I'll follow you anywhere, Ray Dorsey.
So 2011, 2010, you're thinking about doing a remote clinical trial. Why?
Ray, I joined Pfizer back around the end of 2007. I joined Pfizer the week that torcetrapib failed. And for those that may recall, torcetrapib was supposed to be the follow-on to Lipitor. I joined on a Monday. That Saturday, that drug failed. And so it started a series of transformations and changes inside of that company to reinvent themselves and to fill that gap. It created a period where there were some interesting opportunities to disrupt and try new things. I like to think I joined the company at a time when they still had a lot of cash from the old days, but they had a heightened sense of urgency to change, appreciating that the old ways weren't going to work going forward. The idea for the remote trial, like a lot of things that I would pursue, was not just based on some wild epiphany that I had. It was based on my willingness to listen to a lot of different people who had a lot of great incremental ideas and try to stitch them together. And so what the remote trial did was really pull together a lot of components that already existed in the world. Some people had already been experimenting with electronic informed consent and online patient recruitment and the ability to capture self-reported data using patients' own devices. And so many of these pieces already existed. The remote trial really just tried to pull it all together. But getting to your original question for why, I think a lot of the motivation for that was traced back to my own personal experiences as a patient. I had been diagnosed with pulmonary sarcoidosis just before joining Pfizer, and that was certainly impacting my life and my journey. And I always tried to bring that personal patient experience into my work setting. My own use and control over personal health data was critical and essential for me. And I looked at ways that we could empower patients using their own data and more control to drive research studies.
I know you're still very active in the sarcoidosis community. You want to talk a little bit about that work and maybe have a shout out for the organizations you're working?
I'll give a shout out to the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, FSR, and like so many others in the that have been growth-oriented and entrepreneurial nonprofits and advocacy groups. This is a young organization that really looked to the remarkable steps of others, the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, organizations that set a path of owning what research could look like, certainly Michael J. Fox as well. And so despite being a relatively young foundation and not having the capital resources that some of those others, certainly aspires to take a much more entrepreneurial approach to research and working together with other stakeholders to find new.
So a decade ago, you had this idea. You had to get buy-in from your superiors at Pfizer. Generally, pharma is thought to be risk averse. What made them say yes?
So I will add that if I was the father of this field, I was not created by spontaneous combustion. There was evolution before me, and so if you look back even 17 years ago, there were groups out of BU and out of UCSF that had been experimenting with fully online clinical trials for nutritional supplements. And then a few years before us, Eli Lilly had tried to replace select visits in a sildenafil trial by replacing those select visits with in-home participation. And so what we did was maybe wasn't quite revolutionary, but evolutionary, building on that to try to bring an entire trial into the home. I would say that the ability to get that done inside of Pfizer was a convergence of a heightened sense of urgency to change, together with a few very supportive executive sponsors that gave us that capacity. But we also found a strong external partner that was trusted, with Steve Cummings from UCSF. He was known to many in our development organization. And so together with a trusted external partner, we were able to get that green light.
Can you tell us a little bit about the trial? Many people probably hearing about it for the first time, even though it was a landmark study when it was conducted.
It's funny when I mention it nowadays to people, investors or otherwise, people say, "Oh, you mean 11 months ago you did this?" And we say, "No, it's been 11 years now. So this isn't necessarily new work, right?" And nobody knows that better than Ray Dorsey. But the study itself was meant to reproduce the registration trial that had been run for Detrol for overactive bladder. And so our goal there was to take a registration trial that had already been done and attempt to reproduce that using entirely remote and in-home models. This was going directly to patients, finding them online, recruiting, screening them online, and sending them everything they needed to participate in a clinical trial entirely from home. We took a kind of we really looked at this as almost blowing out the idea of centralization. We've used in multi-center clinical trials for many years, we've used centralized labs, centralized IRBs, centralized imaging core labs to adjudicate different types of subjective data from different sites. In this case, it was really just thought of as the greatest degree of centralization. Let's centralize the investigators themselves and enable, in doing so, patients to participate from anywhere. Can we drive greater participation, improved access, and potentially more diverse and representative patient participation by doing so? And so we set up this study to recruit several hundred women with overactive bladder, and had all of the pieces in place for that, together with very strong support from FDA, from the regulatory authorities.
What worked well?
So what worked well was, I think the processes that we put in place to ensure patient protection, patient safety, and data capture seemed like they worked very well. They were robust, they were audited, they were reviewed in terms of process with agencies and ethics committees. And then the flip side, what didn't work well? Well, trying to find women with overactive bladder on the internet is not necessarily a hard thing. Trying to find people who fit the very strict eligibility criteria for a study that was written to run inside of brick and mortar investigator sites, to meet the eligibility expectations of the regulatory authorities, and simply shift that to run entirely online and direct to patient. I think that led to the failure for this study. We were not able to enroll women with the disease severity that we were looking for. We had thousands of women register on the website and go through the screening process, but in order to find the people we were looking for with that level of disease severity, taking direct to patient channels, that was a fail for us. There's certainly some things, though, that I think we've learned from that, and that many, I think, have adapted and are doing better today.
So in 2010, this is like 3 years after smartphones are created, you're doing online recruitment for this clinical trial. And you're saying you got hundreds of people saying, I am a woman, I have an overactive bladder, I would like to participate in this study. but the main issue is that the eligibility criteria was too narrow, such that very few of those people were eligible. Is that right?
So we had thousands. And when you look at sort of the recruitment funnel for that, there were thousands that registered as interested and expressed having the condition. But when you think about that recruitment funnel and all the points of drop off, now we did have a significant number at first that dropped off because we were trying to do some very rigorous identity verification. We were trying to overcome the on the internet, nobody knows I'm a dog phenomenon, and the fact that we would not really know who these individuals were because we were not in person with them. And so we had introduced a lot of identity verification steps that were standard and normal at the time, but were challenging for a lot of patients attempting to go through that process. Identity verification, state of the art at that time, is what many of us have gone through with banks and mortgages and others online. Third parties that, with your permission, check your credit report and pose challenge questions back to you. These are those questions like, which of the following is not a phone number that you had, at any point in your life, or which make and model of car did you have maybe 20 or 30 years ago? And those are challenging questions for a lot of people to recall and navigate through. It's challenging for me to recall and navigate through. And so while we did pivot that, still it was very hard for us to go direct to patient and find the woman that we were looking for in terms of the rest of the clinical criteria, the inclusion and exclusion criteria for that protocol.
And how did you advertise? I mean, I don't even know Facebook. I don't think Facebook was even around. I mean, so what did you do?
I mean, we threw at a lot of different channels, whether it was online communities, whether it was some use of social media. I think we've always been a little bit cautious about places like Craigslist and some that, you really don't know who you're finding there. We didn't want to catch people who were motivated for the wrong reasons to participate in a research study. But the channels that we use going direct to patient, we probably would have evolved quite a bit if we were reproducing that study today versus 10 years ago.
So what would you have done differently if you were redoing the remote study today?
I think for one thing, the patients we're looking for are not medical mysteries. These are patients who most often had a diagnosis and were probably on an existing therapy from another physician in their life. And so these patients were known to the health system. There were medical records out there that know that these patients exist, and physicians that we could potentially engage and partner with. One observation after we started the remote trial that really stuck with me, a head of commercial development at Pfizer, we were briefing him once about the study, and his observation to me really stuck. It was, Craig, you've created here a new way for us to engage with treating physicians around research participation. And that really stuck with me because I'm married to a treating physician. She's never been an investigator in a research study and has no plans to do so. But what are really the options that we give her when we know one of her patients may be eligible for a study? Well, really, traditionally, there are only two. Come be a PI in the study, or go refer your patient to another provider to be in their study. And quite honestly, neither of those are very appealing options for a provider today. This particular individual's plant in my head really left me believing that some of the future here is around how we can partner creatively with treating physicians that do not participate in research today, and use decentralized trials as a way to help them include their patients in research studies in a way that's non-threatening, in a way that they can still maintain engagement and close, regular contact with their patients without feeling like they're sending their patient to a provider across the street.
If you were recruiting today, would you recruit through people's primary care physician in the case of overactive bladder, or would you recruit direct to participants, Google ads, Facebook community groups, or would you do both?
Well, I would probably pursue both. I would really double down on ways that we can engage and partner with large health systems, environments where they may be covering millions of lives and have direct access to patients and know their medical records, and ways that we could work collaboratively. This is why I'm on the board for MedStar, why I put together a deal with Pfizer and Ochsner, and have spent time with so many other health systems out there. I really believe that there's something special and an opportunity that's not being fully exploited today that lets us as research sponsors partner thoughtfully with large health systems and look at ways to leverage their geographic reach, leverage their engaged patient population, but run decentralized trials in that environment. Patients trust their physicians. You look at the average rating on health grades, it's a 4.4 out of 5. Go online this evening and post on Facebook that you're looking for a new cardiologist and watch your friends rush to post. You have to see mine, she's the best. To run trials where we're trying to pull patients away from their physician, the person that they know and trust and have selected in their lives in order to be in a study, I think is going to forever run us up against a wall. To find strategies like how we can leverage decentralized trials to work together with those treating physicians and enable and empower them, ideally without becoming sub-investigators, without being on a 1572, I think can be game-changing.
Just a reminder to our audience, we take your questions. We're going to reserve 20 minutes, so please put in your questions. I see a couple already come in, but we'd love to have more. I'm sure many of you have questions that Craig can answer. So let's turn to clinical trials today. So fast forward to 2020, most clinical trials for most conditions from most sponsors are paused. Most aren't enrolling any new participants. Most are scrambling to handle the participants that are already in the studies themselves. How can they restart?
I think you hit it on the head for where we are today, Ray. I think we do see that most new study starts certainly are being paused, and that enrollment in most studies has been paused as well. I will caveat that with a big most. There are some companies that are trying to leave that position or policy open and somehow flexible for their sites to decide. But I think that's certainly a challenge, and it will remain very patchwork and very inconsistent. You might think that today you're safe to keep enrollment going in Chattanooga until you can't. And so this unpredictability means that we really can't rely on these almost trying to outrun the pandemic by trying to go to geographies that seem safe at this moment. But that last point, I think, is really critical that you raised. We have patients around the world who are relying on investigational medicines for trials in which they've already enrolled. And so how do we maintain access to those medicines for those patients? How do we ensure we can monitor their safety while they're in that study? And how can we continue to capture critical data, efficacy on safety and efficacy, the reason why we're running that study in the first place? And so without those three elements, those studies where patients are relying on those medicines really run the risk of futility. They run the risk of closing early.
So what would your advice be?
Well, certainly today, by now, most organizations have scrambled with some level of countermeasures. These countermeasures including direct-to-patient drug shipments, these countermeasures including home health providers, introducing telephone or video visits, and many starting to look at how they may be able to flex on the endpoints themselves. Changing an endpoint while a study is going is not easy, especially when you've already collected endpoint data for some patients using an earlier method, and you don't really know how long this period is going to go on for. I think for many sponsors, the hope was this was just a 3-month exercise. If I could minimize the amount of missed doses and the amount of missed data during those 3 months, I'm going to be okay. But I think many are starting to realize that this is well beyond a 3-month exercise. This is for many until there's a vaccine at scale for them to continue to expect these types of disruptions, these disruptions where patients with chronic conditions are not going to be able to consistently get out to clinics, these disruptions where we don't know where a new hotspot will flare up and continue to distract the personnel of healthcare centers that would not be available perhaps to even see patients inside of their research centers. And so I think it's consistent that many sponsors today are starting to accept that these changes that they introduced as countermeasures acutely, thinking it might have been for a short period of time, this is going to be going on for some time. This is what they're going to have to continue to maintain their existing studies with these in-home, either technology-driven or supported by home healthcare providers to maintain continuity for those studies. And they're going to have to look at how we continue to use those same tools up front for new studies to get started.
So we're going to get to future studies in a second. We're going to get to one of your countermeasures, digital biomarkers, in a second. Let's talk about another one that you mentioned is direct-to-participant shipping of study drug.
Yeah, that's not an easy one. You know, you'd think that wouldn't be so hard today, right? So many of us get medicines through the mail from Caremark or other mail order prescription houses. But it was surprisingly complicated for us on even the remote trial a decade ago. You know, we kind of made the assumption there that people have shipped investigational product from investigators to patients in trials before. Certainly, Ray, you're up in Rochester, and you may have a patient who's spending some of the winter as a snowbird in Florida and needs investigational product, and it's certainly not out of the question that investigational product could be mailed or shipped to a patient under those circumstances. But what we had to appreciate even back at the time of the remote study was the FDA does not regulate the distribution of medicines in this country. That's regulated by state boards of pharmacy and state boards of medicine. And it's very easy for a research study that is shipping medicine to patients based on a video interaction to bump up against state laws around internet prescribing and telemedicine that were not necessarily written with remote clinical trials in mind. For many investigators, we don't really view ourselves as prescribing a placebo or a control or prescribing, you know, an active drug in a trial. But to many of those same state boards, that's exactly what we are doing, just under the auspices of an IND from the FDA. And so the ability to ship drug to patients can get a little bit tricky. For many, they've been following a path of get the drug to an investigator first and then ship it from the investigator to the patient, rather than sending it from a centralized pharmacy or a centralized drug depot, because that best mirrors some of the way things are described in ICH and GCP, which has something to the effect of the investigator shall provide patient with the investigational product. But that can be a pretty clunky process for some. For others, it works just fine, where either a courier or some other visiting nurse may stop by the site, pick up the drug, and bring it to the patient.
What's the FDA's, how is FDA going to view these decentralized trials?
You know, when we did the remote trial, we put out a press release announcing that we had started it, and I held off on launching the press release, telling the communications team at Pfizer that the FDA wanted to put a quote in the release. And they kind of laughed at me as a rookie, saying the FDA does not put quotes in Pfizer press releases. And yet, when you look back at the 2011 press release from Pfizer about the remote study, you see a quote in there from Janet Woodcock at the FDA. And I think that was really a sign that the FDA wanted to signal to the industry that they're open for innovators, that they're looking for creative solutions. Now, years later, under the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, a public-private partnership running out of Duke University, the FDA themselves drove the launch of a work stream there focused on mobile clinical trials. I had the opportunity to serve on the program committee as that scope was put together, but the FDA leaders were very clear that one of the threads that they wanted to see pursued was around decentralized trials, and that resulted in some recommendations and some guidelines, not a guidance from the FDA, but recommendations through city with strong FDA input around running decentralized trials. And now certainly fast forward to today, where organizations are relying on urgent guidance the FDA has put out around running trials in this environment, urgent guidelines from the EMA around running their studies in this environment in Europe. And you're certainly seeing very strong and consistent support. In fact, when you think back from the FDA quote in the Pfizer press release, the FDA leadership around Citi, straight through to this guidance. It's hard to imagine how people could perceive that the regulators stand in the way of this when all we've seen are very strong signals of encouragement.
And just for those who don't know, Dr. Janet Woodcock is the director for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, so she oversees all clinical trials involving drugs. Our resumption of activity is going to differ. We've done a lot of work with major medical centers. Is the resumption of clinical trials at major medical centers going to be different than resumption of clinical trials at dedicated research sites or some research networks throughout the country that might be better positioned to handle this because they have fewer patients, they have fewer clinicians, probably more control over their research settings than a typical medical center at Columbia University might have, for example.
This is going to be interesting to watch, Ray, as studies start to come back online and which types of settings are able to go back online earlier. Now, on the one hand, large academic medical centers or even large health systems, well, we all know they've just been getting slammed in terms of their resource utilization, in terms of revenue loss, in terms of where their priorities and intentions have been. On the flip side to that, for some, they might view that the revenue associated with clinical research can be very predictable and potentially can help to fill some of the shortfalls that these institutions have been seeing secondary to their elective procedures. I don't think it's going to fill that big of a gap compared to the hole left by the elective procedures going offline, but it can certainly help and help relatively quickly in a way that that institution can control. On the flip side, dedicated research sites may be very well positioned to move quickly. They haven't necessarily been as clinically distracted, but for those centers that are primarily outpatient, many of them have been really financially hit hard here. These independent sites are dependent on new studies starting, on enrollment in trials for revenue. And like any small business, many of them have had to furlough employees in order to get through this period of time. And so as we think about this backlog of study starts, and we start to envision this tsunami of new protocols that are aspiring to get online before year end to hit all sorts of milestones, it is an interesting question of will the sites be there? Whether the independent sites that may have had to have lost employees in order to get through this period, or the large academic medical sites and health systems, will they be ready to absorb?
What do you have a prediction?
I think there's going to be a mixed bag out there. I think certainly it's going to be somewhat geographic, that institutions that continue to be impacted by the pandemic, geographies that continue to be impacted, obviously will have a slower time coming online. But I do think that in geographies where the impact has been lesser felt, their ability to shift and get ahead of new research studies should put them in a good position to get moving quickly. The studies are there. Pharma companies have not been laying off employees right now, right? So those employees are still there. They're still planning to run these studies. Well, I know a lot of the CROs, as we saw from some of the earnings calls in the last week, some of the contract research organizations have certainly felt the hit and are having some impact, some of them, on their employees, unfortunately. They are more of a leading indicator because they're dependent on those near-term studies. I think the fact that the pharma companies are still planning them is a good sign that things will come back online for those sites. But I do think the world has to look different. And I think it's going to be an interesting question of, can sites stand up their own in-home capabilities? Will sponsors allow sites to use their own capability to monitor patients remotely from home? Or will sponsors prefer or insist on using centralized approaches that they can have better control and oversight around?
You mentioned, we just discussed a lot about sites. What about participants? You mentioned pulmonary sarcoidosis. Are people with pulmonary sarcoidosis going to be coming back to research sites?
You know, the good news right now is that there is a heightened awareness of the existence of clinical research as never before. Whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, many citizens across this country and across the globe are actively following medicine development pipelines and trying to understand where is a treatment, where is a cure. They're hearing updates about new clinical trials going live and starting, and talk about control arms and active arms. And so there is a heightened awareness around research literacy and research participation, which I think overall is certainly one of the many silver linings during this tragic time in our collective history. But the idea that these patients are going to be comfortable and willing heading out to a hospital or a clinical site in this environment without a vaccine, I think is very unlikely. And so I think these types of countermeasures, this is why they're going to have to continue. This is why the new normal needs to be this shift towards flexibility, giving patients more choice in how and where they participate. Otherwise, I think we're going to continue to be disappointed in the lack of people showing up as these studies go live.
Can you talk a little bit more about that new normal for studies that haven't yet started? Are they going to redo their protocols? If so, how should they incorporate flexibility into it?
I think that for a lot of studies that are trying to start in the very near term, there's probably not a lot of window for them to change their endpoints around. And Ray, you've worked around these endpoints for some time and know firsthand the level of effort that's required to take a thoughtful approach to introducing a smart new endpoint that's data-driven. You need data, which means you need to have taken time to generate data and evidence to understand how that endpoint can work. And so if there's a team out there that had a study that was ready to go and they're telling their leaders that we're going to start, this summer, and we're going to pick geographies where we're going to start, they probably are not rethinking their endpoint. They're probably just thinking about the countermeasures they can introduce with home health providers and visiting nurses, with remote monitoring technologies for some basic data, some video, and some phone. Now, some of those folks may be thinking about those as safety measures, as second line measures. In case of emergency, break glass, and I'll be ready to introduce and parachute these technologies in, while others should be thinking about these more in the first line and getting ahead of this in terms of understanding that their patients will have reticence. Certainly, I encourage all of those folks to take advantage of this gift of time and stop and talk to their patients. Talk to the patients and the population in which you're looking to run a study, and to understand their concerns so that you know if these countermeasures as a second line are going to be adequate, or if you really should be investing the additional effort to make this a part of the new normal upfront for how you're running your studies. For organizations where there is a little more of a lead time, I think that these are the groups that really need to take a good look at the endpoints they're relying on. If their expectation is that patients should be traveling into a site to watch the patient walk around for 6 minutes on a 20-meter track, and that's a good use of a patient's time and exposure and leaving the house in this environment and going into a clinical site, versus using this gift of time to invest in a thoughtful digital approach that can enable the same or better data to be captured without introducing that burden for patients, this is really their window of opportunity. There are some studies, Ray, that I know that are trying to introduce those types of digital endpoints at risk. They don't have the good fortune to generate data and evidence, and so they're relying on whatever data is out there, looking at how to introduce those in studies to capture data at the home, and trying to generate the evidence in parallel with the hope that the evidence pans out and they're not going to wind up with holes of missing data. But for the studies that haven't yet started, this is certainly an amazing opportunity for them to take a fresh look at their endpoints.
So we've talked a little bit about digital biomarkers. Can you give us an example of some studies that are using the digital endpoints as primary efficacy outpoints in clinical trials?
Well, I wish I could give you a really long list. Some of the list, I think the best places I go to stay current on sort of the active list in the space. Certainly the Digital Medicine Society, DIME, does a great job cataloging in this space with their crowdsourced database. City, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, tries to capture a lot of this. And our friends at Electra Labs that I know you had Andy on Chat Talks a couple of weeks ago are certainly doing a nice job of cataloging a lot of the tools and the instruments in this space. But for many research sponsors that may feel this is daunting or unfamiliar territory, we've been capturing electronic patient-reported outcomes digitally for years. We've been capturing other types of physiologic data using different types of electronic devices for years. And so many of these are can be viewed as more, again, evolutionary rather than revolutionary, which makes it easier for pharma sponsors to be able to consume this if it feels more stepwise and less radical. If they look and appreciate that they've been capturing data like this for endpoints in other ways for years now. But now the areas that maybe they looked at as being risky a few years ago are now their risk mitigation strategies. This is the way they have to evolve their endpoints in thinking about these. So, whether I'm thinking about things as basic as studies where a physiologic data point, blood pressure, heart rate may have been a key contributor to an endpoint, straight through to patient diaries and the like, these are certainly available. But I think some of these other endpoints feel like they're right there for people. And I'll keep picking on things like a 6-minute walk test as a great example. If that's not one that we can pick off and thoughtfully validate for specific disease areas, I can't imagine what we couldn't.
So let's take if there's 6-minute congestive heart failure study using a 6-minute walk test as its primary outcome measure. Are you suggesting that they do the 6-minute walk test at home and time them and do it by video? Or are you suggesting that they consider use a Fitbit and measure number of steps taken per day at the beginning and end of the study to determine whether the drug's efficacious?
Look, I think if I had a study in heart failure right now, and I knew I was going to be missing data because otherwise the data is just not there, patients aren't going to be coming in, I'd be looking at a few different options. And one would be, how can I use video to remotely monitor a patient doing a 6-minute walk test in their home? Now, granted, I'm not going to have all of the controls that I would inside of a clinic where I know it's a perfectly flat and level environment and the terrain doesn't, have anything in the way. But at the very least, I can watch these patients and have confidence that they're not getting distracted and that they're safe and being monitored in that environment. But then being able to also think about ways that I could remarkably transform and improve that measurement. And are there applications out there, and there are, that come very close in terms of enabling me to have the smartphone in their pocket while they're doing that 6-minute walk test and get not only equivalent data, but better data to better understand the subtle changes in their gait or other elements that I otherwise would have lost. And so I think that there are some of these more incremental measures we can do using video. I actually think that dumb technology paired with video is a pretty good way to get through some of this period as we then start to, in parallel, think about some of the smarter technology that we would prefer to use going forward.
I'm going to turn to some questions. We'd love to have more. Dr. Adam Dicker, our friend at Thomas Jefferson University, asks, many technology companies are moving into this space with different platforms. How do you evaluate these technology companies, and how will this shake out?
Boy, that's a great question. I think that you've got technology companies that have platforms to try to consume data, but I think a lot of what Dr. Dicker is pointing out is around the technology companies introducing devices and sensors meant to acquire the data. I think if we think about almost at least 3 different components in this life cycle, we've got the devices to try to acquire the data from the patients. There's technology platforms to try to bring that data together from a patient's home into a centralized data environment. And then there are the technologies that are trying to introduce algorithms that may work across multiple data streams in terms of driving deeper and better insights that we can correlate with a patient outcome. I think across all 3 of these, data will win the day in terms of evidence generation. The expectation that technology companies need to be able to share their data like any other scientific organization, that we can't have these things in black boxes and just rely on white papers. But I think, and I'll point back to our mutual friend Andy on this one, we also have to be very thoughtful about some of the other dimensions around security, privacy, and the systems being used for those different instruments. How can we and our patients have confidence that the data is going where we believe it's going, and that it's being used only in the ways that we're fully transparent around with patients?
Leah Holman asks, what's the biggest challenge you face when conducting the remote trial? And do you think that you would face that same challenge today if you were doing it now?
Thanks, Leah. We were very aggressive on going direct to patient. We really wanted to focus our energy exclusively on engaging patients. And I think we left the patient's physician out. Now, you can go direct to patient, but if you are, I would absolutely encourage people to consider shared decision-making models and making sure that you're empowering patients to have informed conversations with their treating physicians. But to send and push information directly to patients that, quite honestly, are otherwise subtly encouraging them to abandon their treating physicians is really not fair. You're doing a disservice to those patients by not focusing on and giving them the tools to have informed conversations with a treating physician in their life about research participation.
Two things on drugs. One, as we talked about shipping pills. How do you handle infusional drugs?
It's a great question. The organizations providing visiting nurses and other health professionals specifically for clinical trials have been very busy right now with in-home infusion. There are certainly some scenarios where that can get tricky or even almost impossible for an in-home trial. If you're doing a dose escalation study, I could certainly, and that's your first time doing that, I could certainly see people taking pause before wanting to elevate to a new dose entirely in the home. But otherwise, the ability to use a home health professional with an infused therapy is very feasible and happening today.
Another one on drugs. Investigators in Cincinnati, Ohio, research participants in Kentucky. Can they ship the study drug from Cincinnati, Ohio into Kentucky?
Well, of course, this month we could do that, right? Interstate laws seem to have vanished, and it's going to be an interesting question of which of these. So the point that I'm mentioning is in the world of telemedicine, of course, we've seen waivers around expectations for only providing care within the states in which you're licensed. We've seen drops around expectations of using HIPAA compliant software when engaging patients with telemedicine, and we've seen better reimbursement introduced. And certainly those three changes have driven a radical adoption among providers and patients. And it will be interesting to see how much of that persists. But it certainly is. I'm not going to claim to be an expert around interstate drug shipment, and I'm not going to provide any legal advice to anyone who would ever dare to ask me that. But it is not uncommon to see investigational medicine shipped across state lines. I would encourage checking with a person who's more qualified on the law and the details around that.
An anonymous attendee says, how open are sponsors to paying for some of these new technologies for measuring outcomes, some that are super new and maybe untested?
I think you're seeing more and more sponsors making meaningful investments in these areas. You see companies like Roche and Lilly, Pfizer, Novartis, and J&J, and many other household names that are investing heavily in digital medicine organizations and groups that are tasked with bringing in-house, understanding, and working towards validating these new technologies to become endpoints in their studies. So the willingness to spend on the ability to measure isn't necessarily new. Pharma companies for decades have had translational medicine organizations that have really been focused on much the same. How can we measure change in patients as these medicines move from the bench into the clinic? And so these levels of investment may look a little different for digitally focused measurements, but the willingness to invest here isn't necessarily new.
Thomas Zablinski, our friend, says, hello, Craig. Can you explain in your own words the following conundrum? Statistical data are pretty brutal regarding sites and studies and resulting in trial delays. On the other hand, talking to big pharma, you hear there is a problem but doesn't affect us. We're doing fine. Is this a usual smokescreen for the street, or is there more to it? Are pharma companies in more trouble with their studies than they're letting on, and how are they going to react?
Well, I think one of the challenges here is around the financial stability for the investigator site community. And some organizations like the Society for Clinical Research Sites have called on sponsors and CROs to release holdbacks that they may have, cash that they may be holding back per their contract terms, but could be released and help to ensure that this critical stakeholder can still be there for us when we get to the other side. I think, though, when you look at certain data, so certainly WCG, one of the largest ethics committees and IRBs in the US and in select other countries, has been showing us their data on a regular basis on the rates of activity at investigator sites. And I think they've been showing that we've kind of plateaued at around 11, 12, 13% of investigator sites still seem to be operating according to their old levels in terms of recruitment. But other data is coming in showing us that in the Asia Pacific region, new study starts are above prior levels, that they're seeing new studies going online at 130, 140% of prior levels. And so there are these pockets out there where activity is still happening, so that at least in those areas, the pharma sponsors are able to at least show some momentum in this environment.
Dr. Sam Frank from Boston University asks, sponsors and sites are only half the equation in drug development. For the moment, the FDA is holding all its meetings virtually. Will that continue and perhaps streamline the process with regulators?
That's a great question. I couldn't say that I know the answer to it. I think you're not only seeing meetings happening virtually, you're seeing inspections are still happening of investigator sites using remote means. Although I have heard anecdotally that some inspectors from outside of the US seem to still be scheduling on-site inspections of sites, which seems to be a bit premature in terms of people being prepared to respond. But I think it's a really good question to ponder as far as this new work environment for all of us, and how much we'll all continue to hold our meetings in this way, whether it's review and division meetings that the FDA may hold, inspections, or otherwise.
Rick Adler.
I do think this is probably the end of the investigator meeting, by the way. I think that was probably over a while ago.
We're not going to Miami for the investigator kickoff meeting?
I'm not going to see you down there, Ray. Sorry.
Rick Adler asks, how does industry leverage the top-of-mind visibility that clinical trials are receiving during this pandemic to get more patients proactively involved in clinical trials?
I think the media coverage around the existence of clinical trials generally is a good thing, and then that coupled with the ability for pharma to do the right thing during this environment and continue to let doing the right thing lead improvements in reputation and perception. It's been decades with pharma sitting at the bottom beneath tobacco and oil firms, in terms of public sentiment and perception. It may have taken a global pandemic to see them start to at least rise back up a bit. They're certainly not back at the levels of their heyday when brands like Merck were some of the most trusted brands in the country. But seeing some of the signals of doing the right thing in this environment is certainly helping. And I think that, coupled with the continued media coverage of clinical research and clinical trials, will certainly help.
Dr. Sam Frank, I got his affiliation wrong. He's at Beth Israel Deaconess and at Harvard Medical School, so I gave him a second question. He says, we're doing really well shipping study drug directly to participants, but drug accountability has been a challenge. Suggestions?
It's a funny thing. We think about drug accountability in a conventional brick and mortar trial, and our standard, our norm, are pill counts. Right? We have people come in and we dump the pills on the counter, and we count up how many are left in the bottle. And so, can you do that with a remote means using, dumb technology, using a video camera and having somebody, spill out the same bottle to do a count? Or do you want to start to migrate over to some of the more robust measures that are available out there for monitoring medication adherence and surrogates of medication adherence? That could be a packaging technology, whether a smart blister pack or other types of containers that can at least be able to monitor and track open close events, straight through to some of the smart technology. And I think I saw your next conversation raised with the folks from AI Cure. And maybe this is a great setup question, because technologies like those also are a great complement for improving our ability to monitor medication use. Those questions, though, are very often not unique to a remote trial. When we had the original FDA meeting and meetings with ethics committees planned for the remote trial, one of the questions we would keep asking ourselves is, how is what we're doing any better or worse than a conventional brick and mortar trial? And so how do we really know medication use when a patient is at home in between their visits with an investigator site? We don't really rely on very robust measures for any of those studies. And so I don't think a remote trial inherently makes that any more risky. The only other element here is around supply chain. And how do we have confidence that the drug reached the patient, whether that's with courier that we can adequately track, or if we are using a visiting nurse to help us close that supply chain.
And you mentioned AI Cure. Just for those who don't know, they have an app that can watch you. It's called Directly Observed Therapy. Take the pill and ensure that you're actually taking the pill as directed. And then obviously you get timestamps and date stamps and other key features. So in the last 2 months, we've witnessed the greatest transformation of healthcare delivery, at least in my lifetime, and probably longer. We've seen telemedicine go from a niche, less than 1% of patient physician visits, to the dominant means of providing care. Over half of visits for many conditions are done by telemedicine. Are we in the midst of the same transformation in the conduct of clinical trials?
I will give an emphatic maybe. Because what's interesting here, Ray, is I don't think that business meetings will change because companies want them to. I don't think that health delivery will change because hospitals want it to. I don't think research studies will change because sponsors want them to. In all cases, this will continue to be driven by consumers, patients, by the users of all of these different industries, the participants in all of these industries. Now, the good news is that pharma for the last 3-4 years has been doing a much better job of consistently listening to and engaging with patients when planning and designing studies. And so I think that's a really good sign that as they continue to do so, they're going to continue to hear that this is not only the way that is preferred, but the way that actually may be the only way for folks to be able to access. But the only way this is going to stick for pharma is by committing to this change. And right now, the sponsors have largely been living off of SOP waivers and protocol deviations. And words like waiver and deviation imply we're automatically going to bounce back to the state we were in before, as if that were better. And what we need to do is see organizations start to make real commitments to this. Now, what does that mean? That means we're changing how we're writing our protocols. It means we're changing our SOPs around how monitoring and other functions happen. It means we may have to expand some of the vendors and partners that we work with. And importantly, it means we're going to have to start to plan 2 years earlier from the study launch around our endpoints differently, and start to bake into our overall clinical development plan some of this additional effort to rethink our endpoints and make sure that that investment is ready for us. That requires change, commitment, training, and so on. And a few companies have started to do that I've seen, and there are a few others that it's still kind of in the parking lot, if you will.
So can I push you on your maybe? So telemedicine been around for 20 plus years. no widespread adoption, resistance among physicians, unawareness among clinicians, among patients. It really took a pandemic to drive its adoption and rapid change in policies from the federal government. Aren't sponsors and research participants along for the ride? I mean, telemedicine didn't happen because patients were knocking on the door saying, I want telemedicine, and it didn't happen because docs said, I want to do telemedicine. It happened because there was almost no other choice, and the federal government stepped in to enable it.
I certainly think that the physicians and patients simply are changing their hats to be called an investigator and a participant in a research study. It's the same humans. And those same individuals, as you said, are adapting to using these tools. The only other stakeholder that has to get thrown into this mix is a research sponsor, instead of just a conventional payer or other stakeholder that may have been involved on the healthcare side. I do believe that if you are a research sponsor planning to run studies over the next year to 18 months and expect those studies to actually continue with minimized interruption, you have to have these tools and approaches. You have to have these countermeasures. And if we are doing this over the next 12 to 18 months, then it is going to then just become the new normal, that there is no turning back. Organizations will have to make that commitment and the change that maybe they're not proactively doing right now, but it's simply going to have to fall in line.
Great, thanks so much for joining us and helping us see the future. On our next Chet Talk, we go digital. On Tuesday, May 12th at noon Eastern, we'll be speaking with Dr. Isaac Galitzer-Levy, the Chief Scientific Officer at AI Cure. AI Cure first enabled directly observed therapy to be conducted digitally and now has developed numerous digital biomarkers for use in clinical trials, and has an exciting new partnership to announce. If you want to continue our journey into the future of virtual trials, join us next Tuesday. Until then, the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester thanks you for joining us. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Ray.